very warm welcome. You're joining us on this episode of At Hyde Park exclusive here in Colombo as the visiting first Deputy Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund, Gita Gopinath, is visiting Sri Lanka for important discussions with Sri Lankan authorities. I have the pleasure of interviewing Gita Gopinath here in Colombo. A very warm welcome to Hyde Park. We're indeed honored to have you here in Colombo and an opportunity to discuss with you. I'd like to start off asking you how you would characterize the global economic outlook heading into the second half of 2025, and of course what persistent risks you analyze for our part of the world to face, especially how you see geopolitical fragmentation and trade wars affecting the global economic outlook as we move forward.
Firstly, it's a pleasure to join you on your show. We recently provided growth numbers for the global economy in April when we reduced growth projections for the world from 3.3% to 2.8% for 2025. Now, I have to say that this is subject to a considerable amount of uncertainty because the policies that underpin these forecasts have been shifting quite a bit. Trade policy being one of them, as you all know. Tariffs have been up and down and sideways. There are many changes happening on a daily basis to trade policy. And so the actual impact on the global economy has been hard to crystallize. In addition, of course, we've seen shifts in financial market volatility. Borrowing costs are still quite high for many countries. And for most countries in the world, they're actually coming from a period where they've accumulated a lot of debt and growth going forward doesn't look that strong. So in a nutshell, very high levels of uncertainty about the global economic outlook, many risks that are to the downside and that can go wrong. I would just say that the first quarter of this year for which we have data has come in mostly in line with what we were expecting growth would be. So there remains a fair amount of resilience in the global economy. You are seeing some slowing down, but frankly, we are going to see the biggest effects of most of the policies that were put in the second half of the year.
Asia has remained a bright spot in global growth, but what are the key tailwinds and vulnerabilities for the region in the current global context as you outline, and how big of a risk does China's slowdown pose on our part of the world, and especially what are the spillover effects on Asia at large?
Well, we have often said that Asia is the growth engine, one of the big growth engines for the world, especially emerging markets in Asia. But I think the current conjuncture poses important risks for them because when it comes to trade, this is a region, emerging Asia is a region which relies quite heavily on global trade. So the shifts in trade policy, the tariffs, have a fairly substantial effect on the region. In addition, of course, one of the major emerging markets, which is China, has been slowing down in its growth over time. It has several domestic factors that are slowing growth, including from the weakness in the property sector, local government finances, consumption demand being weak. The most recent data we saw has come out with somewhat better figures for retail sales in China. I mean, to your question about how does that affect the rest of Asia, for the countries that trade heavily with China, which are the ASEAN economies, the effect can be fairly significant. So we've done some analysis that shows that if you have a 1 percentage point decline in growth for China, then that reduces growth in the ASEAN countries cumulatively over 5 years by about 1%. So that's about 0.2% shaved off growth on a yearly basis. So this is quite significant that the effect can be.
Sri Lanka, I'd like to talk about the mid-program assessment here is now halfway through the IMF-supported program, the Extended Fund Facility. What is your assessment of the country's progress in meeting program set benchmarks and restoring macroeconomic stability, a prerequisite of the IMF?
Sri Lanka faced a truly severe crisis 3 years ago. And what we have seen in terms of recovery of the economy, in terms of the progress that's been achieved, has been remarkable. You know, there was inflation was running at 70% 2 years ago, and now it's down to minus 0.7%, which is extremely helpful, especially when people have to deal with rising prices and cost of living. This is a huge improvement. The fiscal situation has improved quite a lot. Tax revenues are being collected much more substantially than it was in the past. There's a two-thirds increase in tax revenues being collected as a share of GDP, which is again critical for the reform that has been undertaken. But there are also important reforms being done on the governance front in terms of also expanding the social safety net. So a lot has been accomplished. That doesn't mean the job is done. It took many years to build up to the crisis. It is going to take time to make sure that all the reforms get done and Sri Lanka moves away from the possibility of another crisis happening. So the process is ongoing. The government should stay the course. We're in the midpoint of the program. There are 2 more years left. But even beyond the program, it's important to continue the reform agenda.
Are there signs and risks of another crisis?
At this point, again, lots of improvement that we have seen, lots of progress. We are on the path to the 4th review for Sri Lanka. July 1st is the date that we have for the board who will evaluate the review and make the decision. But again, things are looking well, they're looking good. It's important to stay the path. We should also recognize that the external environment has become much more challenging, especially with all the changes we're seeing in tariffs, with what's happening in the Middle East more recently, what may happen to energy prices globally, lots of uncertainty. So really no room for policy error. It is important to be really focused on getting the reforms done.
Is the IMF satisfied with the level of transparency in negotiations and the pace by Sri Lankan authorities in the process of debt restructuring? And how critical at this point, you spoke about Middle East, you spoke about global crisis affecting our part of the world and especially Sri Lanka. But how important is investor confidence at this stage?
Investor confidence requires macro stability. And the fact that Sri Lanka has, after 2 years, brought a fair amount of stability in its macroeconomy is a very positive sign. Now, what everybody will be watching for is to see how long this endures, and whether is it only a 2-year phenomenon or is it going to be a multiple-year phenomenon, which is why it's important to stay the course in getting reforms done. To the question you asked about our engagements with Sri Lanka have been very strong, lots of good discussions. I had a very productive, very excellent discussion with the president today morning in a very clear sense of what needs to be done in Sri Lanka and the importance of continuing to do the multiple reforms, be it on anti-corruption and governance, transparency, building back public trust in government institutions, addressing poverty, which is too high at 24.5%. So there is a lot that needs to be done. In the case of Sri Lanka and what the external environment implies for it, I think a couple of things. One is, if you look at Sri Lanka's trade with the US, it's about 25% of Sri Lanka's exports. 70% of those exports are in the garment sector, which hire a lot of people. So, it's very important that the negotiations end well. And here, Sri Lanka has actually been ahead of the curve, having lots of good, important conversations with the US administration, which will help them. That has to be resolved well. All of this matters for Sri Lanka's balance of payments, for its reserve accumulation, because as you know, one of the risks is if it doesn't accumulate enough foreign exchange reserves, it's going to complicate its re-entry into financial markets and being able to repay its debt coming due. And we certainly don't want another debt crisis in Sri Lanka anytime soon.
Do you think Sri Lanka is working towards ensuring such a program where Sri Lanka will sustain foreign exchange reserves, incoming foreign exchange reserves, and also how Sri Lanka can work to ensure that the hard-won reforms are sustained beyond these political cycles that we see every 5 years? Is there a risk to reform fatigue here?
Yes. So there has been a turnaround in foreign exchange reserves, like in many other macro variables, going from millions, it's now at 6.5 billion. But that's not going to be enough. You're going to have to continue to accumulate reserves. I think it's important to bring society along, to bring people along to understand the importance of getting the reforms done, because it's not been easy. Sri Lankan people have had to sacrifice quite a lot, and especially the poor and vulnerable. It has been a difficult period for them. But it is important to understand that these deep reforms have to be undertaken. Fiscal discipline is really critical. You can't have very large amounts of subsidies that are unpaid for going into the economy. Make sure that the tax base is broad enough and everybody is contributing to revenue collection in the government. The more the government can do in terms of transparency, in terms of collaborating with society, the more likely it is that the reform momentum will continue. And also, growth is critical. I mean, the fact that we've returned to 5% growth in Sri Lanka last year was very important. And keeping growth strong is going to be important to raise living standards. And that's when people will continue to support reforms.
That takes us to social impact and safety nets. How does the IMF view the social impact of fiscal consolidation here in Sri Lanka? And do you believe there are enough safeguards in place to ensure that vulnerable communities are protected through this process?
Right. So the reason the IMF cares about fiscal stability is because in its absence, you end up with, for instance, very high levels of inflation. That is very regressive. That affects poor people by a lot. When prices are going up or basic goods go up by a large amount, that is very painful, which is why we care about having sound fiscal policy, that you're not in that kind of a position where you put a hardship on people. Now, the way the consolidation gets done, it should be done as best possible by keeping it in a progressive form. And this particular reform that we have puts a lot of emphasis on that. So if I give you some examples, there's much more progressivity in the tax system. We have a floor that we have put on social spending. So before the program, social spending as a share of GDP was 0.3%. We've more than doubled it to 0.7%. And for the first time, that is being met as a part of the program this year. So it's very important to make sure that people feel like there is an inclusive this is an inclusive process, that the pain is not being felt only by certain parts of society, but it is borne by everybody so that you can transition to a much better place where living standards go up for everyone.
Finally, IMF's role beyond financing, what more can you do in terms of development capacity here in Sri Lanka? Anti-corruption measures, government after government talks about corruption, good governance, and ensuring good governance, overcoming corruption. And also, what more can we do here to ensure that Sri Lanka does not go back to the IMF with a situation similar to what we faced a few years back?
I mean, Sri Lanka has to keep with the reform. And again, they've done a lot in 2 years. It is important to maintain that urgency of getting changes made, making sure that there is fiscal discipline, making sure exchange reserves are being built up, making sure that you have strong improvements in governance and anti-corruption. The new governance action plan that the government has put out is an important one. And implementing that and assessing whether that's doing the job is going to be important to make sure that people feel that this program is delivering for them.
Thank you very much for your time here, joining us while you're visiting us here in Colombo. Anything you can share with us about your engagements here in Colombo with authorities?
Very good engagements. We have this on an ongoing basis, but it's always special to come to the country, be in Colombo and have these conversation. I think there's a clear recognition of the issues that need to be addressed and recognizing that the external environment is challenging. And so it is important to deliver on the reforms that have been promised to the people of Sri Lanka.
Thank you very much. Your visit is indeed very important to us here, and thank you for your time joining us at Hyde Park.
Thank you.
Well, we had with us Dr. Gita Gopinath, the first Deputy Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund, joining us on this brief Hyde Park exclusive while visiting us here in Colombo and during important discussions here in Colombo with Sri Lankan authorities. Thank you very much for watching. Have a pleasant evening. Good night.